I'm Marian Wrightington, and I'm today going to tell you about the Peck House, which is 300 years old this year. It was built in 1723. So it has a lot of the original artifacts, and a lot of them have kind of unique stories, so I'm going to try to share them with you. This is called a reflector oven, and you probably have something like it on your outdoor grill at home. But you put the meat or the chicken on that spit, and then this handle turns it in front of the fire, and that cooks it. And so one of the punishments they used to give to the children would be if they'd been naughty, they'd have to sit here and turn that all the time until they were told to stop. And so that's where the expression being done to a turn came from. This was called a gridiron because they would put this right down on the floor of the fireplace, and it was like a broiler. They could put their meat on the top of this, and then all of the drippings would run down into the bricks. It was kind of messy, I would think. But this is where a football field got its name. Some of these were much larger, and this would have been the 50-yard line. And you can see what I mean. It looks like a football field. This is the bake oven. This is where they would have baked their beans and oops, no, there it is. It's kind of messy in there, but the bricks are in the shape of a beehive. It's a beehive bake oven, and they would cook their baked beans in there all day long. And then they'd have them Saturday night, and sometimes they'd say they took the leftovers to church with them to eat in church the next day because they weren't supposed to work on Sunday, so they didn't want to cook on that day. This is called a parson's cupboard, and this is got a lot of different kinds of versions of what it might have been used for. Right now it's full of books, but in the old days they say that they called it the parson's cupboard so that if the parson came to visit you, he might be offered a drink if they kept their liquor in there. And then other people say they kept their liquor in there so that when the parson came, he wouldn't know they had it. A parson is a minister or a priest type of religious person that they would associate with a church. This is called a coffin table, and because all of their funerals were done right out of the house, they didn't have funeral homes back then. Every house, I guess, had a coffin table to set the coffin on at the time of their little service that they would have if someone died. So that's what this was for. You can actually see there was little tack marks all the way around. I think they used to tack like a skirt to it, like well, in funeral homes today they have curtains around the bottom and everything. But this right here is the deed to the property. And so you can see it's all written in Old English, and it's very, very old. I don't actually see a real date on it, but it must be in there somewhere. But that's the actual deed to the property. This is Marian Pierce Carter. She's the lady that founded our chapter of Daughters of the American Revolution in Attleboro, and she's also the one that headed the group to get this house moved across the street to be used as a chapter house. This is Capron Peck. Caprons married Pecks, and then they named their kids the first name of the wife's maiden name. So this was Capron Peck, and on the back of this picture it says, he was born in this house in 1797. His father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and his great-grandfather lived on this plat. All but the latter were born, lived, and died here. Usually when I have people here, I'm saying, can anybody guess what this is? This is a sausage stuffer. They used to put the casing for the sausage on the end here and tie it, and then they'd put the stuff that was going for the stuffing in the sausage in there and push it down like this, and that would fill it. That's also a photo of the house when it was over there. This is they call this a knife box. You keep the knives on it, and the forks for when you're sitting at the table, they're right there handy. And then they used to have a little glass jar that was called a spooner that would held your spoons. This would also be called the keeping room. This is the pantry, and some people called it the milk room. We don't, of course, know, and of course through the years that was probably used for a lot of different things. But a milk room would have been where they had these large pans. After they got done milking the cows, they would put the milk in this to set, and then they would have these pans sitting on all these shelves, and that's what all the shelving was for, perhaps, so that the cream would rise, and then they could scoop the cream off the top and separate it from the milk. This is celebrating an anniversary of the Daughters of the American Revolution. That blue and white dishware was something that was very, very popular, and it was one of the most prevalent things in every house. It was everywhere. This room now is part of our meeting room, and it's L-shaped so we can hold as many members as we can when we have a meeting. But originally, this was probably another bedroom, perhaps, and that was the main living room over there, but we think there was a petition that went across here to divide it. We're not really sure about a lot of these things, and of course, through the years, a family that lived here might have changed the use of each room anyway. So we'll just never know for sure. But today, this is the meeting room for the chapter. This is a sampler. This is dated 1821, and it was done by a 9-year-old girl. The little girls weren't allowed to go to school back then. Only the little boys could go to school because the little girls had to stay home and learn how to cook and sew from their mothers. But those ingenious housewives, they taught their little girls how to read and write through making them do the alphabet on these samplers and numbers. Sometimes they have numbers, sometimes they have Bible verses, and that's how they got their schooling. But at the same time, they were doing all this work. This one right here was done by a little girl in 1821 when she was 9 years old, Carolyn Allen. This is a handleless cup. This is how they used to have cups and saucers, which is kind of different. There's no handle on the cup, and the saucer is very deep. And the reason for that being that when they had their tea or their coffee poured, it was very, very hot. So they used to take it, this sounds crazy, and pour it into the saucer to cool. But then they had a drippy cup, and they didn't want to put it on their nice white linen tablecloth, so they had these little things that were called cup plates that would be to set the cup on while it was dripping. And these are something that's very collectible now. Everything, you'd go to a place to visit that's a tourist attraction, and they'd have a cup plate of their thing, and you could buy it as a souvenir or whatever. But there's all different cup plates. And but that's where that use came from. This one has George Washington on it. They all have different things. They come in different colored glass, and a lot of people used to just collect these when they'd go on a trip or vacation as a souvenir, because the souvenir shops had them in all different colors to do with that particular area. The whole house has 4 fireplaces and 1 bake oven, and you've already seen the fireplace in the keeping room and the bake oven, but this is the one that would have been like in a living room, or they did have fireplaces in the bedrooms too. The 4th one is the one that's upstairs where there's other bedrooms to try and keep it warm up there. This is another cupboard. It's full of books, but it could have been used for liquor too. I mean, it's over a fireplace, and the story goes that it was a parson's cupboard. So, you know, some of these things we'll never know, but the other part of it is one house might have used it for one thing, and the next house might have used it for something else. So, you know, they only had so many things, and they had to make the most of everything they had. This is the other half of our meeting room that we use once a month, and this is another one of the fireplaces right here. They used to keep a little cup of pieces of rolled up paper like this near the fireplace, and then they would light it from the fire, and they could use it to light their pipes or whatever else they were going to be cooking by hand they needed fire in. This little plaque over here talks about Janet White Fraser. She was a lady in Attleboro who everybody knew who she was back probably from the 20s to the 80s. She was a dance instructor, and everybody went to her to learn how to ballroom dance. And she didn't only teach them their dance steps, but she also taught them all their manners. So she was very, very famous for that in Attleboro. And so when she died, we planted that dogwood tree that's right outside this window in memory of her. It was just a little sapling. And being where it wasn't long before some kids came by walking to school and broke it off on purpose. But we didn't do anything about it. We didn't pull it out or replace it or anything. And even though it had been broken off, it grew again. And it's now higher than the house. But we just say you can't keep a good woman down. And that's Janet White Fraser. She was very, very important to our DAR. She was descended from a long line of patriots. She studied ballet in New York. She was a patron of the arts. She supported the Attleboro Arts Museum. She died in the 60s, and she's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. But she was one of our founding members, and she was just a great person. This is what they call a flax wheel. And flax grew in New England. It was okay for this climate. And flax is what produced linen thread. And this is what would spin linen thread. This can also spin wool. But the great big huge wheels, they sometimes call them a walking wheel because the lady of the house would have to walk back and forth to even use it. Those only spun wool from the sheep. But this flax wheel spins both flax and wool. This is a niddy-noddy. After they got done spinning their wool or whatever, they would take one of these and they would turn it like this, and it would supposedly make one skein when it was full. It's the way you buy your yarn at the store now, even with the paper around it. That's considered a skein of yarn. Whenever I do this, I think about, it's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. You've got to keep this hand going like this when you've got this hand going like this. Now we can go upstairs, but I've got to be very careful with my skirts. Now we're in the master bedroom, and this is the fancy bed that the mother and father would have slept in. It's all hand carved and very old. This is called a rope bed wrench. The framework of this bed is just the frame, but then it's got either knobs like these or holes like here. And they would weave the ropes in such a way it would tighten up, and you would put your straw mattress on top of it, which was just like a large pillowcase filled with straw. And then after you slept in it for a few weeks or a month or however long, I don't know, it would start to sag. And so when they started to sag, they would take this rope bed key, and they would be able to slip it into one of those places where the rope was at the end, and then they'd crank it up like this, and that would tighten the ropes again. And you'd be good for another few weeks or a month or whatever. That's where the expression sleep tight comes from. Sleep tight and don't let the bed bugs bite, because the straw mattresses did have bugs in them. This is a trundle bed that you'd slide out during the nighttime for kids to sleep on, but during the day you'd push it back under the bed because it takes up a lot of space in the room, and the rooms were small. They had so many kids back in those days. A lot of babies died in childbirth, or they were stillborn or whatever, and so they just keep having kids to take the place of those, and had to have those farm hands to do all the work around the house. We're in the master bedroom, and it's got its own fireplace for heat. In the summertime, they might have boarded it over like this one is, because of the fact that they didn't want birds to fly in during the summer and get in the house and make a mess. They would close those off and then open them back up in the wintertime when they were using them all the time. And when they were burning, of course, birds wouldn't fly in. This is something that's kind of different. This is called an invalid feeder. And if someone was sick and laying out in bed and they needed to have some liquid medicine or maybe some hot soup, you could pour it in here and then just pour it down their throat. They wouldn't have to sit up to drink it. So that's an invalid feeder. It is nice china. This is a bed warmer. Probably a lot of people are familiar with these. It was cold in your bed because you didn't have any kind of central heat, only the heat from the fireplace. So they would take some of the hot coals out of the fireplace just before they came to bed, put it in the pan, and then they would slide this in between the blankets, and that would warm the bed up for you before you got in. Just like having an electric blanket nowadays, and you turn the blanket on before you get in. This is a large spinning wheel that you can spin wool on. Sometimes they call this a walking wheel because the lady of the house would have to walk back and forth while she's doing it because it's so big. This spins wool, and the flax wheel downstairs spins flax and wool. And you got linen material from the flax, and you get wool material from the wool. So naturally you'd wear more wool in the winter than you would in the summer, and you'd probably wear more linen in the summer. Over here, we have a little table in the master bedroom, which might have been common, and the man of the house every night would write in his journal. This is something else that they seem to do for some reason. And so every night he'd sit down to write in his journal with a quill pen probably, and then after he got it written, he'd take one of these, and it looks like a salt shaker. It's wooden. It's got holes in the top, and you'd sprinkle it over the part you'd just written, because back then you only had a quill pen, and your ink came from inkberries that you had from your inkberry bush, and you just ground up the inkberries to get the ink. So your journals might have been kind of messy. So they would spread this, and this was full of sand, and they'd shake it out, and that would absorb all the extra blobs of ink. And then after they got done absorbing, they would just take the book like this and pour it back into the sander, and then they could use it the next time. So this is one of the first forms of recycling, I always tell people, because they've used it over and over again, the same sand, because it could, after it dried out, it just would absorb more new sand again. This is just a photo album. It's stuffed and it's velvet covered, and then this is metal, and it's got a little latch on the book to hold it all together. Their clothing was so fancy back then. It's just crazy that the things they would have to just wear around the house and do their housework in. And for the kind of housework they had to do, this is a tintype. That was something that was before photographs. And it's actually tin. A lot of families, if they were well-to-do, of course, had professional photographs taken, and some families couldn't afford to. That's a whole chamber set. The basin would hold the water after you poured it from the pitcher, and the little towel racks here hold the towels. That's a pot in case you didn't want to go out to the outhouse during the middle of the night, and that's a bigger pot for bigger things. And but look at how it all matches, and it's beautiful. This is a fireboard. It's a stencil patterns, and stenciling had a whole language of its own. The tree like that, with the weeping willow, actually signified family, because the branches grew and all the children grew and the family line got longer and longer. So that's what the willow tree represents. And then other stencil patterns are pineapples, which everybody knows about pineapples being the symbol of hospitality. That all came from when the old sea captains used to go out on their trips to the Far East or wherever they went, and the natives would greet them on the beaches with pineapples and grapes as a sign of love, peace, and hospitality. And then when the sea captains came home, they would put the pineapple out on their front steps as a sign to their neighbors. This is a signal, we're home, come see what we got. And the neighbors would come over and they would serve them pineapple rum punch. And it got so associated eventually with hospitality that some people would start carving it into the pediment over their front door, a pineapple. And then they started, in the guest rooms in their houses, they started putting pineapple post beds, because it all just represented hospitality. So the willow tree is family, the pineapple is hospitality. Wheat is another symbol, and that meant that you were, your food was all in for your harvest was in for the winter, and you had food for winter. So that means like you were prospering, the wheat. This would have been a bedroom, but we call it our museum room now because we have all these little artifacts that we like to display, so we just use this room like that. But the best thing about this room is the floorboards. Huge floorboards. The story goes, and of course we can't verify any of this stuff because these people just aren't around anymore, but the story goes that the king did not allow the colonists to take the big trees down that would have supplied the wide boards. He wanted all of those big trees for his masts, for his ships in the Navy. And so the colonists would be fined if they found they had cut down one of the trees. If the tree blew down in a hurricane or a storm, you were allowed to take it. But if you chopped it down, then you'd be penalized. And he actually had his soldiers go around to the houses, supposedly, and go in and check to see how wide the floorboards were. Some books tell you that it couldn't be over 12 inches, some say 18 inches, so those things we just never know. But the soldiers lots of times would just come in and they would just look downstairs and then they'd leave. And if they didn't see any wide floorboards, you were good. So that's why the colonists started putting the second floorboards that were wide that they'd taken that they weren't supposed to have taken on the second floor. And you go into some antique houses and the attic has got wide floorboards. And it's the same thing. They're just hoping the soldiers wouldn't come to check. But these floorboards are huge right here, and they must have come from one big tree. This is a shuttle, and shuttles were part of the textile industry. Attleboro was a textile town. We had Dodgeville and Hebronville, and the shuttle was used to take the thread or the yarn across the loom to weave it. And that's how they did that. And that's why today we have shuttle flights and shuttle buses, because they take you back and forth. And Colonel Blackington actually had a shuttle shop producing the shuttles for those two textile mill villages. And that's what his business was. This is a coffee grinder. This is to do with the print business. You'd put ink on it and roll it. This is called a goffering iron. This is iron, and you'd put this on the stove and heat it, and then when you were ironing your dress, if it had a big ruffle on it, you could put this between this and this, put the ruffle between these two things, and the heat would make it all ruffly so that when you wore it, it would be all fancy and ruffly. That's part of the honey process from a beehive, the smoker. It was called a smoker. This is a Ginny Lind spool doll's bed. Ginny Lind was a Swedish singer that P.T. Barnum discovered, and he brought her over from Sweden and traveled all over the world with her. This particular kind of furniture with the little spool shapes, that particular kind of furniture came out right at that time period, and so they started calling it Ginny Lind furniture. It's a china doll. She's got a china head, she's got a stuffed body and china hands. It's even got the ropes and the ticking mattress. And like I said, Ginny Lind was very popular at the time. This haircut here is what Ginny Lind used to wear, so that a lot of the dolls had that same hairdo on it. The ladies used to wear these long hat pins in their hats to hold their hats on their heads. They actually were a form of a weapon for the ladies. If somebody was walking down the street and got attacked by somebody, she could pull out her hat pin and stab him. These are all eyeglasses, shoe buckles. One day I was dusting up here, and I took the cover off of this jar, and I looked in and I saw all this black stuff in there, and I thought, what the heck is that? I'll have to clean that out. And so then I read the note that's underneath it, and it says, "Do not destroy the contents of this jar. It is the burnt mortgage." They used to burn their mortgages after they paid them off, and they'd have a little ceremony. So this was the burnt mortgage for this property. These are all little high-button shoes that the kids would wear, all different kinds. The ones with the buttons would be lefts and rights, but somebody at Sturbridge Village told me once, the cobbler man who was there, that they didn't have lefts and rights until the 1880s or so, that they were just all the same. These kind of daguerreotype photographs, some china, and then this. This is a hair wreath, and it's all made of human hair, and you can see the different colors. This gray hair, reddish hair, brown hair, black hair, and it was to memorialize all the different people in a family. And somebody spent the time to make these little flowers out of the hair and then put it into that hair wreath. Everything was donated from the different early DAR members, and to me, I just think that they had things at their houses and they didn't want to throw them out and they didn't know what to do with them. Oh, I'll give them to the DAR house. So that's how we got all these things. That thing there with the teeth was used to clean the wool after they'd shear a sheep. They'd pull that through that, and it would pull out like the pieces of grass or bugs or whatever else it had in it. This is just a wringer. You put a cloth in there and it would wring it out. This is a cranberry scoop. That's the thing for passing your pledge at the church. This is another doll that looks like Ginny Lind again, in a carriage. Now we're going into the back bedroom, and this is where more of the kids would have slept. And if all of the kids didn't fit in the bedrooms they had, they'd put them on the floor in the attic, because there is an attic here too. This is another rope bed, and all the ropes are woven into it. See the ropes? Braided rugs were also something that was very common in these kinds of houses. It would be rags or clothes that were outgrown or things with holes in them that they would just take the cloth and make it into a braided rug. And hooked rugs were the same thing. And the ladies seemed to find the time to do that sort of thing. These are all some clothes from the different periods. This is their little washstand, like the one in the master bedroom. It's got a bowl and pitcher for your water and the towels to use. This is Frances Carpenter's wedding dress made in Rehoboth, where she lived. She never wore it because her lover died in a political duel down south. His picture is hung in Goff Memorial Hall in Rehoboth. And this was a wedding dress, so I guess they didn't care about it being white or whatever. But I think it's silk. This is a little child's dress. These are just all some clothes, and then there's more clothes over there. Everything was always very fancy. I mean, look at the needlework here. you know, that kind of thing. And all that lace, that was all hand done at home. You didn't run out to the store and buy this stuff. And this is just for a little kid. She's going to outgrow it soon. And look at the embroidery on it. It's crazy. This is an old cameo. A cameo is made by carving shell. You know how cameo is a brown background with a white top? It's because they carve the white down to the beige or tan or whatever color you want to call it. They just carve that part away, and so it's actually all one piece, but it was carved from shell that came in layers of colors. This is my apron, and I just can't believe that anybody would go to this much trouble to do all this embroidery on something that they only wore around the house. This was all done by hand. And then my petticoat is really crazy. My petticoat is 12 feet around the bottom. And there's not a machine stitch on it. It's all done by hand, the seams and everything. And all of this cut work, they punched out the holes for the eyelets, and then they embroidered all around them. These are the men's hats. These were made out of beaver, but there's two different kinds here. One is a summer one and one is a winter one. Can you see the difference? There's a hole in the top of that one, and it was to let the heat out. So this would be the kind you'd wear in the summer, and this would be the kind you'd wear in the winter, and this would keep the heat in. But they're both made out of beaver. This is a potty chair, very obviously. And you'd use it in the middle of the night instead of going out to the barn or the outhouse, wherever it was. And then in the morning you'd have to empty your pot. And then this door, it's just storage. But if you go around this corner, it actually goes up to another attic. And that's, like I said, if they had too many kids that didn't fit into the beds, they'd have straw mats for them up there on the floor, and they'd sleep in the attic. We'll keep trying to preserve this house, and we hope you enjoyed your tour, and happy 300th birthday, house.